is this thing called the future? Well, obviously, the future is that space and time that is yet to happen. That speaks for itself. And because of that, because it's yet to happen, it's also obvious we have no scientific facts about the future. So we can't predict the future. We have to treat it carefully, treat it delicately, and always be aware that predictions are impossible. What we can do is try to gain more knowledge about that future. And in doing this, there are some basic things we need to be aware of. Some are pretty obvious. I'll just flash them. Literally, that one. We know that change is rapid. It's pervasive. It's always present. Nothing new about that statement. What is different, however, now the 21st century, is that the pace of change and the pervasiveness of that change and the omnipresence of that change is far more than ever before. Part of the problem is that traditional forecasting methods are usually constructed on the assumption that tomorrow's world will be much like today's. Having said that we cannot predict the future, and having said that we have to be careful not to simply assume that history will repeat itself, what makes our life a bit more frustrating is we do need to recognize that sometimes history does repeat itself. We do have the phenomenon of long-term cycles. What is preferable is to create a desired future, but it does require at least three characteristics. You need to want to create a preferred future. You need to conspire to do so. Conspire in the nice sense of the word. And you need to act with some kind of wisdom, understanding, purposefulness, and insight. And this is where we start getting to grips with what this game is all about. Futures thinking and scenario planning. So, we can't predict the future, no crystal balls, no scientific facts about the future, so what are we doing? Well, we're trying to gain more knowledge about those factors that will shape the future. That we can do. In short, we are trying to develop foresight. And foresight can be acquired. We can gain foresight. It comes from three basic sources. First of all, good old-fashioned experience. And secondly, it's important to have open, informed discussions. And the third source of foresight is scanning the environment, looking around you, understanding what's going on. We must be willing and able to suspend disbelief. We must never say never, expect the unexpected. I say, mother and apple pie, but it is interesting that throughout history, we find examples of how people, very clever people, very wise people, have failed in this regard. And it strikes me that businesses and or ordinary South Africans, certainly, have three ways in which they think about the future. And I'm calling the first one the que sera, sera approach. I shall not burst out into song, but that was a well-known song many years ago. Loosely translated, what will be, will be. This is when an organization says to itself, we know things are changing, and they're changing rapidly. But I'm small, I'm insignificant, I can't do a thing about it. So if and when that change happens, then and only then will I start reacting. Of course, a very short-sighted approach, a very dangerous one, hence the thumbs down. In some ways, what frightens me more, and I'm certainly not going to mention any names, is you find organizations, all human beings, who adopt the NIMBY approach, not in my backyard. So yes, change is happening, obviously. It's happening quickly. But I am so big and powerful. I've been around for decades. I have a big or a healthy bank balance, a very healthy balance sheet. So I don't need to worry about this change. The third approach, and obviously as you're about to see, the one we are trying to promote in thinking about the future, I call the Baden-Powell approach. Lord Baden-Powell was the founder of the Scouting movement, and their motto is, be prepared. In this context, prepare yourself for change. Again, think about it. I think it's important, and it's an argument I'll develop as we go along, to realize the benefits, but also the limitations of scenarios. Sometimes people want to read too much into a scenario exercise. But as long as we know what we're talking about and what they are, what they're supposed to be, they can indeed be very useful. Now, the question came a bit earlier. You asked a question about the purpose of scenarios. By and large, today, I'll be concentrating on that first one as a tool to facilitate strategic decision making. There are other possible reasons for using scenarios. The advocacy tool, as an advocacy tool. In other words, to promote a particular kind of objective, if you like. And perhaps underlying all of those, an exercise in intellectual inquiry, digging deeper, surfacing assumptions, questioning assumptions, reformulating assumptions. How do we go about doing a scenario exercise? So, we've got the question, we've got the issue, we know what's bothering us, and now we want to use a scenario exercise to gain more knowledge, to explore all those factors and forces that could have a bearing on that particular issue. You now typically say, right, members of the team, you've got an hour or half an hour or whatever time you have at your disposal to brainstorm. Literally write down on a piece of paper or write down on a yellow stick-it or record it in whatever fashion suits you best, write down whatever comes to mind. What forces, what factors could have a bearing on that particular issue in the time scale we are considering? I repeat, at this stage, it's carte blanche. You can write down whatever you want. Anybody can write down whatever they want. Now, it's very interesting. There's no science behind this, but I've discovered in the last 15 years, without any preemptive suggestion, that the number of clusters tend to be reduced to between 8 and 12. Once that's been dealt with, now the real hard work kicks in as we start looking for the next two words, key certainties and key uncertainties. In other words, we're looking for those factors that are important. They're going to have an impact on the concern, the issue that we have. There are certain things that we're pretty certain about in a fairly short time frame. But the longer the time frame, the fewer pixels we have. This was a picture of the future. The shorter the time frame, the more dense the pixels. We're pretty sure about that. The longer the time frame, the more uncertain. So again, some things which might be key certainties for the next 2 or 3 years might indeed, in a longer time frame, become far more uncertain. Important, but the outcome might be far more uncertain. But the really crucial ones are the so-called key uncertainties. Again, they're key, they're important, but you're not quite sure how they're going to pan out. Those variables most relevant to a particular situation, the issue, the concern, with the highest impact potential, which may be positive or negative, or if you like, the known unknowns. You know they're important. You know they're going to have a major bearing on your particular concern or issue, but you don't know how they're going to unfold in the time frame we are considering. This is a way of figuring out the key certainties and the key uncertainties. It's called an impact uncertainty matrix. Well, we have a number of forces, which we'll talk about in a few minutes' time, and we slot them into one of these 4 quadrants. Some of them we are relatively certain about, and the impact could be high. That, of course, will become our key certainties. Some we're much more uncertain about, but we know the impact will be high. Those will become our key uncertainties. Those that are certain but with a low impact, we can ignore. And those that are uncertain with a low impact, we can also ignore. So we're essentially going to eliminate the left-hand side and just stick to the right-hand side. But once we've got the key uncertainties, we then need to decide as a group which 2 of those are the really core issues, which are the really important ones. And what we do with those 2 key uncertainties, I'll write it down over here very quickly. Again, probably all familiar with this. We draw them in terms of 2 axes. So the one key uncertainty along this axis and the other one along this axis. Let's call it A1 and A2 and B1 and B2. And A1 and A2 represent the 2 feasible polar outcomes of that key uncertainty. And then we hope that each one of these 4 blocks will give us, I'm going to use the word again, a plausible scenario. What I often advise is at this stage, try to give each one a descriptive title at this very early stage. Because from here onwards, if the title is correctly chosen, then it's much easier to relate to what you actually mean by these scenarios. Now the question is, well, what are you going to do with them? Well, you need to populate each one so as to tell a story. You have to populate each quadrant in order to enable you to tell a story. Now, how do you populate it? Remember those 150 stickers up here on the wall? And all your key certainties and all your other key uncertainties? Well, you take them away there, as it were, and plug them into the most appropriate block. You just have to tell a story, short and sweet, no more than a page per scenario, for the ultimate user to be able to relate to, understand, and see the implications. You might write a sort of a preamble to the scenarios, saying, in the following exercise, where we're going to discuss 4 scenarios, please bear in mind, dear reader, that the following forces are present in each one of those 4 scenarios. I want to sort of summarize some of the thoughts I've said so far, introduce a few new ones, and I'm going to show you just 1 or 2 thoughts taken from a book or a monograph written a little while ago by Nick Segal. He was asked and tasked to write a story about scenarios in South Africa. It's called Breaking the Mold, the Role of Scenarios in Shaping South Africa's Future. But from this, from his analysis, he's identified, again, some very important and at the same time practical lessons, if you like, which I think we can also find very useful. Every exercise is unique. Therefore, the methodology adopted for any given exercise may also be unique. You're able to combine the intellectual and the experiential approaches to public policy. The fundamental keys to success lie in the skills of the facilitator and then who you have in your team. The power is its ability to be dispassionate, to allow logic and common sense rather than predetermined notions and conclusions. It must have legitimacy among the groups it is targeting. You have to choose the right cast of characters. How do you disseminate the message to the ultimate users? The message must be simple, must be clear, must be memorable. You must have clarity of purpose. Why are you doing it? What do you want to achieve? For whom is who do you want to try to influence? Is the timing right? There must be uncertainty, enough uncertainty and risk, so the project participants are almost desperate. They are having sleepless nights, and therefore will be willing to think outside the box. Must be legitimate. You might need to be politically connected or correct. What about the facilitator? He or she must be independent, neutral, must be willing to listen, must have a sense of fun, and very importantly, knowledge of the subject matter need not be a requirement. How big should the scenario team be? So not more than 20, certainly, that becomes impossible, but not too few. I mean, you need to cover as many bases as possible. And then finally, what methodology? Well, again, as I said earlier today, whatever you want really, as long as you know why you're doing the exercise, as long as you follow the basic processes. And these days, we're starting to say the shorter and more intense the exercise, the better. The test is whether the exercise has succeeded in the following. Have they helped you to clarify the future? Not predict it, but help clarify the way in which various forces might interact with one another. Have they helped you to identify future problems? From the scenario exercise, you might say, oh my goodness, we better watch that factor over the next couple of years. That could have a big bearing on our company's future. They must be relevant to your organization. They must help identify what needs to be changed. They must be credible and intelligent. They must be plausible. If you can, you must involve the ultimate users. And then finally, again, the test for plausibility. They must be internally consistent and logical, as we try to do in those few examples. This has been obviously an abbreviated back of a cigarette box kind of approach, but the approach remains the same whether you've got 2 hours at your disposal or 2 years at your disposal. Right, thank you very much.